Hi, it's Dave here with another demo for you. Today we're going to be going through a Google Analytics platform into Azure using Data Factory. So this was asked for by one of my customers as just a demo to show that we could kind of do this. It turns out to be fairly straightforward. So we're starting with analytics. That gets dumped into BigQuery. This is all within the Google platform, so I won't be showing you that. We are going to start the demo from this point onwards and just pick up that Google BigQuery data. So this is going to work for any data set that you've got in BigQuery. And there are instructions. I will link down below to the instructions on how to get from analytics into BigQuery. And I'm sure there are many other use cases for this type of stuff. So once it's in BigQuery, we're going to be using Data Factory here to collect that data, for which we need the BigQuery connector. So that connector, we're going to be setting up the security with the service account. As such, we're going to need an integration runtime. Just that's the way that the connector works. It is possible to use an Azure data connector from Data Factory natively, but for that you're going to have to use account authentication instead of service account authentication. And obviously we're doing this in an enterprisey kind of way, so we don't really want individual user accounts being used for authentication. So we're going to use a certificate file that's going to be copied onto this integration runtime machine. The machine then talks through a firewall outwards to the Data Factory. Once in Data Factory, we're going to go copy it into Blob Storage. That could be anywhere on your data lake. It doesn't really matter what the destination is. The purpose of this demo is just to show we're getting data through the system. So the other thing within this demo is in Data Factory we're going to be using tumbling windows to get the data. The reason that we're going to do this is we need a start and an end time so that we can collect that data. So if you've got historic data back over this side, we would be able to set up a job that runs from 2 years ago, has a tumbling window once a day from then or once a month, and that will carry on into the future. So that we can get all of those old bits of data, but we're doing it as individual jobs, so if anything fails we've got a much smaller set of data to deal with, and moving forwards we can collect that data on a daily basis, an hourly basis, whatever kind of schedule you want, and we use those start and end times within the query to BigQuery. So it's just a SQL query saying if start time is greater than this and if end time is lower than this. And it's as simple as that. I'm going to put the information for this in the link section down here. If you go to the GitHub for the page, there is a full list of instructions so that you can recreate this for yourself. Please don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you enjoy the video and the demo, and don't forget in the comments section to request any other demos that you may want or need. And I'll be happy to look into creating those for you. So for this demo, you're going to want to head over to github.com/DaveDoesDemos and go to the GBQ demo and click on the instructions. So in here, there is going to be some code that we need just to create a database, fill it with data. So you want to log into there. It's also obviously got all the instructions as usual. Then you're going to want to come to cloud.google.com and log into the console. So I've got a free account here, and I'm using this just for the purposes of a demo. Obviously, if you're doing this for real, you're going to have a Google Cloud Platform all set up. You're probably going to have BigQuery, or you're going to have Google Analytics. So you're realistically going to be using those when you're doing your actual ingestion. But if you want to follow along for the demo, just create yourself a free account and you can do everything I'm doing here. So first up, we're going to create a project and give it a name. So here we're going to just call it GBQ demo, and I'm going to auto generate a project ID just to obfuscate the name a little bit, and because I kind of like the naming scheme. Then we're going to just create. And that's going to go away and create us the project. This is where all of our stuff is going to live for the demo. So once we're in here, we can then create our database.
Once your project's ready, we're going to go and click on the navigation menu and scroll down to BigQuery. And this is where we're going to use some of that code that we got earlier. So we'll copy that. So first thing we're going to do is create a data set. I'm going to call this GBQ demo. This is case sensitive, so you may find if you've mistyped it or something, then the script won't run, so just modify the script or use the exact name that I've got here. And then we'll click on the dataset once it's created. We'll paste in the code that's just going to create a test table. That test table is going to have two columns. One is just a string called name, and the other one is a date of type date time. And we're going to run that query, and that then creates us a test table. So then come back over to the instructions and we'll copy this data out and we'll paste this in here. So what we're doing here is we're creating a bunch of rows in there, inserting a date, and the name, all I've done is just use the actual date that we're inserting into the date column, and I've translated that for text just to make it easy to see. So what we're also going to do here is just going to add another one. So you want to have one that is in the future, so that we can see a particular feature of Data Factory later on. So we'll change that to 2019, and we'll just do February. Change that to 02. So 29/02/01, February 1st, 2019. So today's date is the 19th of January. So when we create the trigger in Data Factory later on, what we're going to do is we'll run the job from the beginning of December. So we won't be getting these November rows back, and we'll end it in mid-February, but we won't get this row back because that job won't run until the 1st of February to actually get that back. So that will demo nicely the tumbling window trigger functionality in Data Factory. So that's run successfully. If I come back in here and just hit query table, it automatically gives me a query statement in there, so I could just hit run and verify that all of my data has turned up exactly as expected. And that's the database configured. So next we're going to test the query that we're going to use in Data Factory. So I've copied this into the instructions for you, but when you're creating these for yourself, you're going to want to test the query at this end before you start doing stuff at the Data Factory end, just for your own sanity more than anything, to make sure that you have a query that's definitely going to work. So this query is selecting star from the table, where the date is greater than date time, and I've just put a holding date in there, and end time, and I've put another holding date in there. So this is currently doing 2017 up to 2019. So if I click run, that returns almost all of my data. And if I just change this to 2018/12/01, we'll see that is then going to remove the November ones. And this is what's going to be returned. And effectively within Data Factory, this is the start of our tumbling window, this is the end of our tumbling window. We're going to pass those in as variables so that each time this runs, it's going to run and return the results from the start of the window to the end of the window, and we will have a window once per day or once per week or whatever we choose to copy that data into your data lake on Azure. So we've got that query working now, and we'll save that for later. So normally you kind of copy that into a notepad or something. So next we need to create some credentials for Data Factory to connect. For that we're going to come into the menu and go to APIs and Services and then Credentials. And then in here we're going to create some credentials, and we are going to do a service account key. Going to create a new service account. We'll call it Data Factory, and I am just going to select BigQuery admin. As with all of the stuff here, when you're doing this in production, don't make Data Factory a BigQuery admin, give it the correct permissions. I'm just doing it for simplicity and speed here. That's then going to give us an email address as the username, and we're going to select P12 for the certificate file format, and that's then going to give us a file that we can download and save, which we'll use later to copy to the integration runtime. So private key save to your computer. We'll close that one and we'll click save on this. And there is my service account all created. So if I now go to manage service accounts, I can then copy this email address, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste that into Notepad, and I'm going to need that later for the Data Factory configuration side. I've also saved this file, so I will use that later and upload it into the integration runtime, just to allow me to connect back into here. So next you need to log into the Azure portal, and we're going to create a resource group for the demo, just like we always do. Make sure that we encapsulate all the components so that at the end of the demo we can just delete that resource group. So again, we'll call it GBQ demo. I'm just going to use the default region, and we'll click create. I won't bother tagging it today, but normally I would put a tag on at the resource group level. So that is now created. And we're going to start adding resources within there. So we're going to need 3 resources in here. First one's a Data Factory, obviously. Next we're going to need a storage account, which is going to be our data lake for the demo. And finally we're going to need a virtual machine. This virtual machine is going to be our integration runtime. The way that the Google BigQuery connector works is if you want to use a service account, then it has to use the integration runtime. For an enterprise environment, you would want to use a service account. If you're just messing about, you might want to use a normal account kind of integration, in which case you can get away with the Azure runtime. So the Data Factory we're going to call GBQ demo, and we're going to pop that into the resource group that we've created here. We're going to go with version 2. We don't need any of the other features. There will be a demo coming up about data flow soon. And for the location, I'm going to choose the just a East US, I guess, and click create. Okay, once that's creating, we're going to create another resource. Storage account. And we're not going to go data lake this time, just Blob Storage. It's a bit cheaper, and for our purposes here it does exactly the same thing. When you're doing this for real, make that decision based on your requirements at the time. See if we get lucky on GBQ demo. lowercase only. That is available, so we'll go with that, and we will put that into the East US region along with our data factory. It can be pretty much anywhere. We're going to go standard, going to go V2, and we're going to go with the cheaper LRS storage, and going to go next. We don't want any of the stuff enabled there, and so we'll skip to review and create. And we're going to click create. As soon as that's creating, we click create another resource, and so we're going to go with Windows Server 2016 Data Center. You can use any supported version of Windows for this. I don't tend to use servers very often these days, so I've not really updated my skills to the newer versions. So select our resource group. Give it a name, so GBQ demo again. This will also be in East US. We don't need infrastructure redundancy for this, it's just a demo. We're going to go with Windows Server 2016 Data Center image, and then we're going to create a administrator account. So we'll say Dave does demos. Nice long password. And we don't need any incoming ports. We will be using RDP for this demo, which will open automatically later on. But there's all of the traffic is outbound from the integration runtime, so it's nice and secure from a firewall perspective. In production, obviously, you wouldn't configure this with a public IP and RDP incoming connections. This is purely for the point of the demo. So we'll leave this as default. Don't need a data disk because this doesn't store any data. Go on to networking. So I'm just going to let it create me a network. I just don't care what any of this stuff is. It's the only virtual machine that's going to be on there. Again, in production, you might be putting this on an existing VNet, which might be connected back to an express route or via VPN so that you can connect without using a public IP. So we'll have a basic NIC security group, and going to allow RDP. And this is the bit that you would want to change to none if you're doing this in production. So we're not going to have any load balancing, and we're going to go next. And I don't care about any of this stuff for my demo. What I will do though is I'm going to put auto shutdown on to switch the machine off at 7 o'clock. So if I forget that I'm doing this demo, if somebody sends me a really important email in 5 minutes time, then I'm not going to get distracted and run up a huge bill just because I wanted to do a demo. So I suggest you do this anytime you're demoing or testing stuff, just so that you don't get that conversation with your boss later on, where you have to justify a large expenditure. So we're not going to put any extensions on here. We're not going to tag it. We're just going to create. So one thing I didn't select was the machine type. For this demo, it's not really going to matter, but the integration runtime technically has requirements of 4 CPUs and I think it's 8 gigs of RAM. For this demo, we are getting 7 rows of data, so I'm pretty sure it's going to cope. So I'm going to let that create now. The Windows deployment takes a little while, so I will cut that there and we'll come back to it once it's done. So in the meantime, while the machine is being created, we can see loads of resources have now popped up. I'm just going to go into my storage account and create a container for the data to land in. So click on Blobs, click Add Container, give it a name. Lowercase only, so I'm going to call it data from GBQ. Private access, so we don't want this open on the internet. For obvious reasons, this is our data that we're getting from Google BigQuery. Obviously that makes no difference for the demo, but in production, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're setting these things up correctly. So that's there and ready to get our data once we've configured everything. So once the virtual machine is deployed, we're just going to go in and click Connect. And that's going to give us an RDP file to connect to the public IP. Obviously, if you're doing this on a corporate network via VPN or ExpressRoute, then you would do this through the internal IP address. But here we're just going to download that RDP file. Also, if you are going to use a public IP address, I'd strongly recommend using just-in-time access. Again, this was just a demo, so I didn't do it that way. So log into the machine as usual, and here I won't do that. I have already logged on. So once you're on the virtual machine, you need to go to Server Manager. And click on Local Server. Wait for that to load. And we're going to change the IE configuration to off for enhanced security, just so that we can download the integration runtime. So I'm going to paste in, sorry, that was the wrong thing. So I'm going to go back to the instructions and we're going to copy this URL from the integration runtime section and paste that in here. And we're just going to download this. So I don't need the release notes. Save. Then once this is downloaded, just hit run. accept the agreement, click next, then click install. We can close off the Internet Explorer. And we'll just pop the enhanced security back on. And that's just going to run through the installer. It's not a particularly big program, so this only takes a minute or so. And then once that's finished, just click Done. And we'll get the Integration Runtime Configuration Manager. Will automatically start running, and we can then come in here to do the registration. So next up, we're going to come into our data factory that we've created and click on Author and Monitor, and that's going to launch the Data Factory Designer interface into a new browser window. Once that's loaded, we're going to go to the editor and connections, then to integration runtime. So we need to register that integration runtime we've configured. So we're going to hit this top button and click next, and hit self-hosted and click next. We're going to give it a name, so GPQIR for integration runtime. Bit of a description, type is self-hosted, so we click next. And then it gives us the keys. So we'll copy that key and come back over to the integration runtime computer. I think that's because I selected the wrong size machine. And we're going to paste that key in. We'll get the green tick and hit register. So that's then registering, and we're going to hit finish. Now, that just goes through some key exchange stuff and registers this with the service so that we can start using it. And that's all done, so we're going to click close, and we're pretty much finished with that machine now, and we're certainly finished there. So here I'm going to paste the key that we've got from the Google account onto this machine. That's just a copy and paste through the RDP window here from your downloads folder or wherever you downloaded the file to. So we'll go into this PC and C drive. Do not put this on D, it will disappear when you reboot the machine. So new folder, keys, and we're just going to move that file in there. So then I'm going to just launch Notepad. and I need this path to register this this service. So once that's all done, we're going to flick back over. Once that's all done, we're going to flick back over into our Data Factory, give it a refresh. The integration runtime should now be running, and we're going to pop over into linked services, click on new, and do a search for BigQuery. So continue there. I'm going to leave the name as the default here, and we're going to change the integration runtime to our Google BigQuery one. And I'm going to paste, I'm going to change the user authentication type to service authentication and paste my key path in here that we've just copied from the virtual machine. So I've also got my email address from that service account that we copied out earlier. I'm going to paste that in here, and then I'm going to copy the project ID directly from there to paste up here. And that's all we need to configure, so we'll hit test connection, and hopefully that comes back okay. It does. Connection successful, so we just click finish here. And we can now use this connection to connect to anything in that BigQuery instance from our Data Factory. So that's done. We're then going to create a Blob Storage connector to connect to our data lake. So again, I'm going to use the default name. I'm going to use the built-in cloud integration runtime here, and I'm going to select from my subscriptions, and I'm going to choose the GBQ demo. Test the connection again, connection successful. This is Azure to Azure, so that just works every time, but it's always worth testing the connection at this point to make certain that everything is set as it should be. And that's done. So that's our connections set up and the integration runtime configured. So next we're going to create the data sets. Just click add data set here, and we're going to create the Google one first because that's our source, and then we're going to create the Blob Store one. So just drop down on the connection tab to our Google BigQuery connector. We'll hit refresh there just to download the table information, and I'm going to select the test table as my table. I can also hit preview data to just load a preview of what's in that table, just in case I wanted to test something. So come over to the Schema tab, and we can hit import schema, and that will automatically go look at the table, get the schema information, and fill it in here. So it's getting both of those as a string. We can then change this to a datetime type of a variable if we wanted, and we can choose formats and cultures and that kind of thing. And when we use these as a sync, we can also change that format so that we can push it out as a different format on there. So then we go to add data set to create the blob storage, and drop down to the connection that we've already got, and then we're going to browse to the data from GBQ container that we created earlier, and I'm going to leave this in text format and comma separated values, but we could also change that to any one of these formats. And when you're running through your demo, just give those a go. If you choose JSON, it will literally just convert it to JSON on the fly. Similarly, we could change it to tab separated values if we were pushing this to a machine that needed that. So for the file name, we're actually going to use a parameter. So if we take a look in instructions. And in here we've got the variables are documented. So we're going to call it run start date, and we're going to have another one called run end date. So click new here, put run start date in there. It's going to be a string, and just no default value is fine here. So if we come back over to the file name, click add dynamic content, and then we are going to use a date function, and that date function is format date time, and then we're going to take the run start date within that, and we're going to format that to a 4-digit year, 2-digit month, and 2-digit day. And it's important to use the capital M's there. Capitalization is important here, so there is full documentation of this date time format on the web. Do make sure that you're using those properly, because it's easy to make a mistake there. So what this is going to do is it's going to take the incoming date time variable or parameter, and it's going to change that to, for today's date, it would be 2019-01-20. And each of the files is going to take that name, and because we've got 24 hours on our trigger, this is going to create one file per day with all of the results for that day. And this is a pretty common scenario for Data Factory. And so on the schema, we're not able to import the schema here because we don't have any data in the sink at the moment. There are two ways we can deal with that. One, we can process a file, create one, and then pull the schema back in. Or three ways, I guess. We can go to the Google BigQuery and copy the JSON code from there and then paste that JSON code in here, or we can type it in manually. So I'm going to have two columns, date time and name. So if you notice, the names are different to the ones on the Google BigQuery. So we've got name and date, and over here we've got date, time and name. So we're going to map those on the next step to make sure that they line up. And again, we can choose the type that we're writing these out to. It's a CSV, so it's going to be text, so I'll leave those as default. And then we're going to click Publish All just to save that configuration. So while we're in here, and before I move on, I will just show you the code behind the scenes. So in here, we can actually see the structure that we're giving it for the schema. So we can actually just come in, directly modify this, copy and paste it, and it goes live in the interface. So if I change this date time to date time now and click finish and go back to schema, you can see that that's changed it to date time now in the interface. And I'll just change that back and republish. And so with that, you can much more quickly copy and paste schemas between jobs. You can copy and paste entire data sets between data pipelines, and you can really industrialize the way that you're creating these things. So finally, we're going to create our pipeline just using the Add Pipeline button in here. When you're using these with bigger projects, you would also obviously create folders to put all this stuff in. This is just a demo, so we just don't have that much stuff. So in the pipeline configuration, we can give the pipeline a name. I'm not going to rename that now. And we can create parameters. So I'm just going to copy that parameter name from the Blob data set that we just created and click New and run start date and run end date. And these are the two variables that are going to be asked for when we trigger. So if I do trigger now, that's going to give me an error because I don't have anything on yet. But that would ask me for those parameters at runtime. So I'm going to just copy in a copy data This is probably 99% of what you'll do in Data Factory is a copy data job, just going from A to B, and it can transform on the way. So the name I'm going to leave as the default. Normally we would tick secure input and output because obviously we want to secure everything. So onto the source, we're going to select Google BigQuery, which is the one that we created earlier, and we'll ignore the rest for now. On the sink, Azure Blob, and then on mapping, import schemas, and we just check that date is going to date time, name is going to name. So it's worked those out nicely, even though they were the other way around and I've renamed one. It's automatically guessed. And behind the scenes, that's probably because these two are called name, and it guessed that the other two therefore must have been mapping to one another. There are some settings here that we're not going to use for the demo. Look those up for when you start using this in anger. But for now, we'll just move on. So on the query, we're going to set a query here and come back to our instructions to find that query. That is this. So I'm going to click Add Dynamic Content here. And the reason for that is that we're using parameters. And if you just paste it in, it won't know that they're parameters. So it's best to do everything from here. So double check that the variables are the same as the variable names that I've used. So run start date, run end date. Select star from gbq demo.testtable. So this is the wrong way around. That's obviously a typo in the instructions, which I'll change before you come and use this. So where date is greater than the start date and date is smaller than the end date. So that's all good. Click finish. And so now we're going to run this query with those start and end parameters to get our incoming data. That's going to return the rows just between those two dates. And then we're going to write those out to Blob Storage. And so this is expecting a variable here for that Blob Storage. So we'll just come in here and choose start date, which is what we're expecting, and click finish. And that will then pass the parameter from the pipeline job into the Blob Storage component so that it can generate that file name that we did earlier. So that is the copy job created. So finally, we're going to create a trigger to run this. And I can do a trigger now if I want to, just for testing purposes. But if I do that, I'm going to have to manually type in my run start date and my run end date in the correct format for a datetime variable. I'm not going to do that because I want to create a new trigger. So click through here, give your trigger a name. It's quite handy to use a unique name there, just for when you're debugging or when you're looking through the logs so that you can actually see what's happening. So we're going to use a tumbling window and the start date of 1st of December. And you remember the database has some data in it from November. So we're not going to have a trigger for back in the November timeframe. We're going to start on December. And this is going to create a job for the first, a job for the second, a job for the third, etc. So click apply on there. Change this to hours and 24. So as you can see, you can set this to arbitrary time windows. So you could have a tumbling window of every 15 minutes if you wanted to, depending on your data set and how often you want to ingest. Balance that against the kind of impact on your source systems or on how often you need that data refreshed in whatever the data lake is dumping out onto. So we're going to set an end date as well, and I'm going to set that to the 13th of February. And again, I'm going to go with midnight as the time. Click apply. So this date is after the last entry in the database, but we're still not going to see that entry because that date trigger is not going to be created until that date happens. And so we're going to just get the ones up to current time. So don't need to set any advanced settings, but we do need to make sure that this is activated. And then we're going to hit next. And this is where we configure these variables. You're going to need to come back into the documentation for this. So we'll scroll down. To the trigger, and I'm going to copy just one of these and paste it into both. And so I copied the start time, so I can just change this to end time. Obviously you could just go back and copy the code for the end time one, but I find it quicker just to do this. So then I click finish, and that creates the trigger. This is not going to do anything yet though. I then need to actually publish. So click publish all. That will then push this out into my job queue. And we then wait just until we get the pop-up to say that that's happening. So publishing now. If I come over to monitoring, then I can see all of my jobs have been created. So I can scroll down there, and there will be a job in here from the 1st of December right up until today. So if I click on the pipeline button for the top one, then I can see some information. Down here is where you're going to kind of troubleshoot. This is watch, this is inputs, and these change as the job progresses. So the input, I can actually see the query now, and I can see that that's 2019-0104 to 2019-0105. And that's going to go off to Google and try and get that data. So click back to all pipeline runs, and by now we should start seeing some succeeded. So if I now click the pipeline, then I get inputs, so 2018-12-14 and 2018-12-15. I can now also see outputs, so data read 0, data written 0, files written 1, rows read and copied 0. So there wasn't any data on this date, but the job was successful nonetheless. We can then click on the watch button, and we can actually come in and see the duration was almost instantaneous. This isn't a particularly big job, and we can see how much data has gone through, etc. And so if I now come back to my storage account, back in the Azure portal, then I will be able to see the output of all of these jobs. So storage account there. And go to Storage Explorer. You can, of course, also just browse through Blob, which is the old way of doing this. But I'm finding now that it's there, Storage Explorer is a much nicer interface for just browsing the data. So expand Blob containers, data from GDQ. And what we can see here is a whole bunch of files. Some of them have data in, and some of them don't have data in. So here, 13th of January was one of the dates that was in the database, and up here we've got 3 dates that have got some data in. So if I just double click one of these, that opens, and we can see in CSV format, so you can see the comma in the middle there. This is the row of data from the database. So if there were multiple rows that day, maybe with different times, we would actually have got multiple rows in this as just a CSV file. But if I come back to Storage Explorer, you can see the dates go from 2018-12-01, which is when we started. So it's retroactively created jobs for each day is run that job per day, and the ones that have data have returned that data, and it's come right up till today. So 2019-01-19, if I just hover there, that's the 20th of January. So right up to the time that we'd expect that last file to be running. And then tomorrow it will run again, and it will create another job in the job queue. So if we go to all pipeline runs, we can see all of these are either in progress or succeeded. And tomorrow we'll get another pipeline run here that will be triggered by our trigger 1, and that is just going to run a single job tomorrow and see if it can get any data for that new time window. So it's important to say these don't necessarily run in order. There's no need for it to, because the way that we set it up is with those parameters to put bounds on the data that we're collecting. So if I wanted to, I could now go back into my Storage Explorer, delete all of that data, recreate the trigger, and it would repopulate everything back from the database again. So it works a little bit differently to how you kind of traditionally would have a scheduler that runs every day, because we can create windows in the past and still get that data segmented up nicely, so that when we do a big data processing, we can then have the data in lots of files, which means that we can have lots of nodes to process it, which means that we can run against more data in a smaller amount of time. So upcoming, there will also be a demo on data flows in Data Factory, and that's going to allow us to take this data and really quite simply create a data pipeline with much more advanced processing in there, and we'll submit that to a Databricks cluster, automatically create the cluster, destroy the cluster, and process that data. So really quite a powerful system once you've got up to speed with it.